Hello everyone! Before we move on and set up our interior page template, I first wanted to cover something very important, and that is avoiding CSS and JavaScript caching during development. Let's begin with a question. So what is caching? I think the best way to answer that is with another question. Have you ever made changes to a CSS or JavaScript file, but then even when you refresh the website, you don't see those changes taking place? It can be confusing, it can be frustrating, and the culprit is usually caching. Your web browser is using a cached or downloaded copy of the file instead of actually re-downloading and using your newest copy of the CSS or JavaScript file. Let me show you how you can see caching in action in your web browser. So on our site, you can right-click anywhere on the page and choose Inspect. I'm using Google Chrome, and I encourage you to use it as well because it has some of the best developer tools in the world, but most browsers will have a similar Inspect feature. That will open up your Developer Tools window. Again, if you want to follow along with me exactly, you'll want to use the Google Chrome browser, but then I want you to click on this tab that is named Network. I know that Firefox also has a very similar network feature. Okay, now with this Network tab open, if we refresh the page, on Mac you can press the Command key and R at the same time. On Windows you could hold down the Control key and press R. But when we refresh, now we can see all of the different files that this website needs, or that this website is using. So we can see different JPEG files, different CSS, JavaScript, and up here we can filter what type of files we are looking at. So you can say show me all files, or you can just say show me JavaScript, CSS, only show me the images. And for our quick example to learn about how caching really works, let's click on JS for JavaScript. And I want you to focus on our file that is named scripts-bundled. And also pay attention to the size and time columns. And notice that every time we refresh, it says that it takes 0 milliseconds to load that file. Now, whenever you see 0 milliseconds, or in the size column if you see from memory or from disk cache, that means that the browser is not re-downloading the file. Instead, it's just using a saved or cached copy. Now, a lot of times that's great. It can make your website load faster for your visitors. However, during development, we are going to be changing our files very regularly. And when we switch back from our text editor back to our browser, we want the browser to always be using our most updated copy of the file. So the question becomes, how can we force the web browser to re-download a new copy of our scripts-bundled? Well, follow along with me. In your text editor, within your theme folder, I want you to jump into functions.php. At the moment, we've only got our one function, and remember when we used wp onQScript to load in our main scripts-bundled JavaScript file. Well, you might remember that we set its version to 1.0. Now, just as a test, let's change this to version 2.0 and save our file. And now back in Chrome, with our Network Developer Tools open, refresh the page. Perfect. Notice that our scripts-bundled file now says that it's 93 kilobytes and it took 627 milliseconds to load. This is because the web browser saw that version 2.0 at the end of the request is different, right? Just a second ago, it was version 1.0. However, if we refresh again, well, now the browser is just going to use its cached copy of the 2.0 request. So you can see that time is back down to 0 milliseconds. And this means that if we made changes to our JavaScript file, we would have to go into our functions file and change this to maybe 2.5 or version 3.0. Now, obviously, we do not want to have to keep going into our functions file and changing the version numbers every time we update our JavaScript or CSS. So instead, I want to show you a neat little trick to avoid caching altogether during the development phase of your website. Delete the 3.0 or 2.0 or whatever number you have, and even delete the quotes. But keep the comma, and in the place where the quotes just were, I want you to type out micro time and then parentheses, because this is a PHP function. Now check this out. If we go ahead and save, and then go back to our DevTools and refresh, you can see that that microtime function generates the current time in seconds and milliseconds, which is always going to be unique. So every time we refresh, cool, you can see the file has a size and it has a time that it took to download. And you can refresh all day long, and every single time now the browser is forced to actually reload that file. Now, you would never ever want to do this on a live production website that the general public is visiting, but during development, when you're coding away and your files are changing all the time, this is a lifesaver. So later on in this course, when we are learning JavaScript and updating this file constantly, we will be super happy that we've got this cache fix in place. Changing gears, what about our CSS? So if I click CSS in the filter, here's our main style sheet. Now in this course, we are not going to be editing the CSS. Writing a bunch of CSS is just outside the scope of what we're trying to learn in this course. However, I still want to show you how to disable caching for your main CSS file, because this is a trick you could use in all of your other WordPress projects as well. So back in our functions.php file, here's the line of code where we loaded our main CSS file. Now after this second argument that points towards the file path, let's just add a comma and say null, which means this file doesn't have any dependencies. It doesn't depend on any other CSS files. And then right after that, we can just say comma, include another argument, and this is the version number. So just say micro time, parentheses, because it's a function. Let's go ahead and save that. And then if we refresh our network tab or the website, cool. We can see that every time we refresh, our web browser is forced to use the absolute most updated copy of that file. Now, before we bring this lesson to a close, some of you might have been yelling at the screen this entire video saying, Brad, what are you doing? You could have just simply checked this checkbox that says disable cache. While that's true, I usually don't like to use that option, because now literally every single file is going to be re-downloaded every time. And that can just slow down your development process. I only want to disable caching for a few key select files. Also, in Google Chrome, this will disable caching for all websites and not just your development website. So if I go to Google or Amazon or Facebook, all of those websites will load significantly slower because I have this disable cache option checked. So I like to leave that unchecked and just use our microtime trick to disable caching for select files. Cool. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will get back to the actual task at hand of building our website, and we will focus on building an interior page template. Should be a lot of fun. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.